would take me around the southern tip of the Isle of Man and much of the way up the west coast, from Port St Mary to another similarly sized little town called Kirkmichael, following a coastal footpath known in Manx as the Radney Foiler, or the Way of the Gull. The total length of this trail around the island is just over 160 kilometres. I then began walking down to the seafront to once again see the harbour where my father's catamaran had been moored. I stopped close to that spot and was suddenly overwhelmed by a cascade of memories. My dad had spent considerable time in the harbour making the boat seaworthy. I'd also helped him in this before taking off on my overseas travels. I seemed to sense a whiff of paints and solvents as I gazed at the empty space for a few moments before moving on. The cafe looks out on a narrow sea strait that separates the much larger Isle of Man from a small island called the Calf of Man. I would traverse the Sound en route to Port Erin before heading up the west coast from Erin to a town called Peel, about 11 k's short of my final destination for that day. I saw what I took to be the same large gull I had seen earlier, looking directly at me. I passed it by, walking as far to the left of the path as I could comfortably manage without seeming to be taking any special measures to accommodate the bird's stubborn nature. But while my actions may have been bold, in truth the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end and my whole body was covered with goose pimples as I walked past the bird, keeping it in the corner of my eye as I did. I had my first and least significant accident of the day. Apparently simultaneously, a sudden gust of wind hit me from behind, and my right foot slipped on a piece of loose rock. My right knee hit the ground, and my right hand, outstretched to break the fall, was slightly grazed after making contact with the rough ground. But with no forethought on the matter, I stopped about 5 paces short of the spot at Spanish Head where we had taken photos in 1973. Somehow my body was unwilling to go any closer. But it wasn't any big deal. I wasn't in any kind of battle with my body to force it to the edge. I just stood there for a few moments, and the memory of the previous visit came back. Coming out of Braddock Glen, the Way of the Gull hugs the southern side of the headland to the north of Port Erin Bay, and hikers very quickly leave behind the sheltered glen and the nearby houses, and find themselves on a much more wind-swept slope, leading to a strange Gothic-style tower which stands atop the headland. At one point there's a fork in the trail, leading more steeply up to a stone wall, demarcating the end of grazing land, both higher up and where I was standing. I stopped to take a couple of photos at this point, one in the direction of the tower, the other in the direction of Port Erin itself. I was struck by the fact that I had hiked this route many times and never even thought to take a camera with me. Yet now I felt the need to make some photographic records, as if some inner voice was telling me I may never have another chance. Inside, a narrow stairwell spirals up past moist, dim chambers to an airy, roofless top floor with a high wall. The tower looks like the kind of place you may expect to find a fairy tale princess to be kept captive. And I was to find not one princess there, but 2. But first, I took a photo of the drop down the rugged slope to the sea, which was not sheer but very steep, at about 65 or 70 degrees in places, partially rocky and partially grassy. I even noticed my own shadow in the viewfinder the moment I clicked the shutter. But the next moment, both my shadow and its owner were tumbling roughly down the slope. And there was the gull, still soaring, but now 30 or 40 meters north of where I had last seen it. "Wish I could move like you," I commented, as I gazed at the bird, still not daring to move, but knowing that eventually I would have to. You may not be getting far, but at least you're in control. Then a slow realization came over me. Maybe I can move like you. I would very shortly pass a high point along the trail, which was certainly my favoured spot in good weather for sitting down, taking a break, perhaps a bite to eat, or even cracking open a beer while taking in the magnificent panoramic view. I stopped only for a short rest and a few bites to eat from my lunchbox at Glen May, a picturesque glen with a shallow, pristine, clear river and a waterfall. I didn't want to eat enough to make me feel too relaxed. By the time I got moving back on the trail, it seemed I was only marginally behind schedule. Now I felt I knew with certainty I was going to make it to Kirkmichael, maybe even Derby, and I definitely had enough time to take a few photos in Peel. Peel Castle is set on St. Patrick's Isle, a very small island off the coast and just to the south of Peel Harbour, and the sandy beach which lies to the north of that. The castle was first built by Viking rulers in the 11th century. Even though some parts of the trail between Glen May and Peel were quite steep, I was not only walking fast on this section of the trail, but on a couple of occasions actually jogging. That came to an end when I heard something fall from my day pack.